Old people, when they lose weight, almost half of their weight loss is probably from muscle. And so we need to really think about healthy ways for older people to lose weight and maintain the amount of muscle they have. We can do a lot with diet, I think.
How do you suggest people do that with diet?
Well, your colleague Don Layman has been a big proponent of thinking about protein and its overall health effect. As I said, when older people lose weight, they lose a lot of muscle. And partly it's because if you think about it, an older person already has a low need for calories. And so if you think about an older person going on a 200 to 300 calorie a day deficit diet, that means that their protein intake is really low. It's probably below the recommended dietary allowance.
A special thank you to one of the sponsors of the show, and that is Apollo Neuro. I'm sure that you guys have seen on my stories or some of my podcasts that I am wearing the Apollo. The Apollo is one of my favorite devices. It's a wearable that improves your body's capacity to manage stress, to sleep better, stay calm, be focused, be more present, and feel less overwhelmed. I use this thing 3 hours a day. It was developed by neuroscientists and physicians. The Apollo delivers silent vibrations. Put it on your wrist, you'll feel it, and you can control the magnitude of vibrations. I love it, especially instead of that extra cup of coffee, although sometimes I use it, but I like to try to be responsible in my caffeine consumption. And the Apollo wearable is incredible. It helps train the nervous system to cope with the environment better over time. I recommend it to all my friends, and you can get $40 off the Apollo wearable at apolloneuro.com/Dr. Lyon. apolloneuro.com/Dr. Lyon. You'll get $40 off. I know that you guys are going to love this product. I only sync up with products that I use and love myself. Dr. Bill Evans, thank you so much for coming on the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show. This episode is going to be pivotal for people's education. And I'm going to tell you why. Because for the longest time, we've been talking about lean body mass. And we've been talking about lean body mass as it relates to the hallmark of health, right? And we have not found that there are many correlations of lean body mass versus skeletal muscle mass as it relates to health and wellness. And you, my friend, are creating a whole new paradigm and a whole new era of thinking about skeletal muscle. No pressure.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey, that's for sure.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your background. Which is quite extensive.
Well, I did my graduate program at Ball State University, which at the time, and still does, I think, has the premier human performance laboratory. And upon completion, I took a position as a faculty member at Boston University. And at the same time, I did a postdoctoral fellowship in nutrition at MIT under the guidance of Dr. Vernon Young. And then I guess I was in the right place at the right time. In 1982, there's a brand new facility being built in downtown Boston called the Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University. It was a 13-story facility right downtown in the medical school, and dedicated to attempting to understand what the nutritional requirements were for older people. And there were a number of different human nutrition research centers, one at Baylor, the Children's Nutrition Research Center. Ours was for aging. And I was very fortunate to be invited to be one of the initial lab directors. And my lab at the time was called the Human physiology laboratory to kind of understand the relationship between physical activity and nutrition needs and how they might affect older people. And so I was there for about 11 years, and during that time, we conducted what I think is some really seminal studies. I was the first to describe the condition sarcopenia, which we can discuss a little bit later. At the time, I defined it as the age-related loss in muscle mass, which I thought would ultimately predict, disability in late life and other age-related problems. I left Penn State, or I'm sorry, I left Tufts and joined Penn State as the director of what was called the Knoll Laboratory. I got recruited to the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, which had just received a large gift to establish a Center on Aging and Department of Geriatrics. I got recruited after about 11 years in Arkansas to GlaxoSmithKline to head up their muscle metabolism discovery unit. Was there for about 5 years, and now I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley and at Duke University. So I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and then I commute out to Berkeley to teach when I need to.
Incredible. Incredible. I would love to start off the conversation. Why don't we talk about sarcopenia?
Sure.
And why don't we talk about, the rates of sarcopenia? Well, number one, the definition of it and how we can quantify it. And I think that would be a great conversation.
Sure, and it's a it's a good and important question. So, initially when we were doing research, we were looking at ways to increase muscle strength. We had noticed that one of the primary, if not the primary, functional deficit that occurs as we grow older is weakness. And weakness then affects almost everything else that we do. So some of the early studies that we did was we took older people and put them on like weightlifting programs and saw that we could double and triple their strength, which was really quite astonishing. And we were able to measure how much muscle they had by using the CT scans. We did a study in a nursing home, it was funded by the National Institute on Aging, in which we took older people in their 90s and were able to triple their strength. And no one had ever really shown that before. And I think it really demonstrated the power of exercise and the fact that nobody is too old to start. Our oldest was 98 years old, and we were able to really improve his function. At the same time, we showed that his balance was improved, his walking speed was improved, spontaneous activity was improved, and depression was affected. And so I thought, it's the amount of muscle that we have that really is the determiner of how strong we are. And that was the initial definition, the age-related loss of muscle. So the problem is, since that time in the early 90s, there have been dozens and dozens of large, what are called cohort studies that have measured what's called lean body mass. And lean body mass isn't only muscle mass. And that's one of the assumptions has been that muscle mass is exactly the same thing as lean body mass. And we know that it's not. Lean body mass, in older people, muscle is only about 50% of lean body mass. Lean body mass has water and viscera and fibrotic tissue and other components that are not muscle. And so after decades of research, the fundamental conclusion was that lean body mass has very little relationship to outcomes in old people. And that it's actually strength. If you actually measure how strong people are, that is much more closely aligned to risk of getting a disability. So it was assumed that there must be, if lean body mass isn't really that closely associated with these outcomes, then there must be some intrinsic quality of muscle that's changing. And all along, nobody was actually measuring muscle mass. It was measuring how much muscle you have.
Can you say that again? Because again, your work and the work that you're bringing forward now with D3 creatine is going to change. I think we're going to have to go back and reflect on all the literature and much of the narrative and much of what we believe to have been good science is actually, I think, going to change. So if you could just say that again.
Sure, I think it's fundamentally going to change. It goes back to maybe the initial definition that muscle mass is actually pretty darn important because, and I can tell you very briefly what our method is. We're trying to figure out, how do you measure how much muscle someone has? And it turns out that, you've probably, most of your audience have heard about creatine and creatine supplements. And it turns out that creatine is really important to how muscle actually functions. And so about 98% of all the creatine in your body is found in muscle. So the idea here is that if somehow we can measure the total amount of creatine in your body, we can actually have a pretty good measurement of how much muscle you have. And it turns out that creatine is not made in muscle, it's made in the liver and the kidney, and then it's actively pumped into muscle cells. And so our idea is we use what's called a stable isotope. It's a heavy hydrogen label we put on the molecule creatine. You swallow it. It's a very small capsule, tracer amounts. And then the beauty is that it's transported to all your muscles. And then the further beauty of creatine is that it's turned over, or it's excreted by the conversion of creatine into creatinine and then lost into urine. And so it's a very simple idea. You take this label, it gets transported to all your muscles, and then you lose the label through creatinine in urine. So we can take a single urine sample, look at how much of this deuterium label is on the molecule, and then know exactly how much muscle you have in your body.
And to frame this for the listener, up until that study, up until this method, what is being used or what has been used is DEXA, CT, MRI.
Right.
And none of those directly measure skeletal muscle mass. I mean, I suppose CT is the gold standard for those listeners at home.
Or whole body MRI,
right.
But they're very, very expensive and
not practical.
Not very practical. And so that's why this method that you mentioned, DEXA, has been used in dozens and dozens and dozens of studies. And everybody assumes that it's a surrogate for muscle. And even we get to the fact that even those who think, well, maybe DEXA isn't that great, will measure what's called appendicular lean mass. And so if we just measure the arms and legs, maybe that's a pretty good estimate. And it turns out that our method is unrelated to the measures of lean body mass.
So what does that mean?
So what that means is that all of the data on the relationship between lean body mass and outcomes is wrong, is simply wrong. And so we've published now about 15 papers in large what are called cohort studies, where we've shown that we first showed that cross-sectionally muscle mass is really strongly related to how well you function, what your walking speed is, what your strength is, and how much you fall down in old people, in old men. And then looking longitudinally, we've been able to show that muscle mass is strongly related to risk of disability, even what's called instrumental activities of daily living, which is kind of like your ability to balance your checkbook, is related to how much muscle you have. It's related to a risk of a hip fracture. It's related to mortality. And interestingly, the estimates of lean body mass are unrelated to these outcomes. So
That's critical,
yeah,
critical to understand.
so now we have data that has allowed us to convince reviewers, um, not all reviewers, but reviewers, such that we've now um, added this measurement to the Framingham Heart Study. So we're measuring this muscle mass longitudinally in Framingham. We've added it to what's called the Tobago longitudinal aging study, which is measuring African Caribbeans, and we just added it to the Women's Health Initiative, which would be 18,000 measurements in older women. So now, for the first time, we'll be able to say that muscle mass is related to these important outcomes. And what that allows us to do really is really focus on muscle, perhaps as the thing that you want to affect. I mean, I think everybody probably realizes that muscle is really important, and it's important for moving around. But it's the amount of muscle that you have that appears to be the most important thing. So anything that we can do to ultimately help us in that regard is going to prevent disability and keep us independent.
This is critical that you're saying that, because there's a large body of evidence that solely talks about strength in the aging population, that muscle mass doesn't necessarily matter because it's really been grouped as lean body mass.
Right.
And
That's right. And, strength is obviously important. And the reason why it's been important is because if lean body mass is a pretty poor predictor of how much muscle you have, strength is probably pretty good. And the fact that strength is related to some of these outcomes is really an indication of how much muscle you have as you grow older. So, and it's important to note that, obviously, many of your reviewers and listeners, um, we think about muscle as important for climbing stairs and moving around, but it's important in a lot of other ways. For example, muscle is the primary determinant of your basal metabolic rate, how many calories you use at rest. And so as you lose muscle, your calorie needs go down and your body fat goes up. It's attached to bones, and it's called skeletal muscles because it puts stress on bones. And muscle probably helps to prevent osteoporosis. The more muscle you have, the less bone loss you'll experience. Muscle, we now know, secretes a whole host of what are called hormones or myokines that have a broad array of metabolic effects. And we just published a paper recently in older women that shows the amount of muscle that you have is really associated with your risk of diabetes, your glycemic control. So muscle has a lot of obviously really important functional outcomes, but the metabolic outcomes are probably just as important.
critical. And the listeners would totally agree. We talk about muscle as the organ of longevity. We talk about myokines, things
Yeah,
that are very, very critical. And
I
often
think the longevity you're calling it the longevity organ is absolutely correct. Probably more so than any other organ system that we have.
I agree, my friend. And, one of the things that has become an issue is we've always focused on obesity, or in the literature, it is all about obesity rather than the preservation of muscle. We are very obese centric versus muscle centric, and that
Yeah,
has created quite a bit of issues as it relates to how do we move forward for people.
yeah, you're absolutely right. We published a paper not too long ago there is kind of what you're talking about, a syndrome that some people have called sarcopenic obesity. And the idea is that in older people that have low muscle mass, if you have more fat, that's really bad. And we published a paper recently that said, no, that's not true. The fat is far less important, even in obese people, than how much muscle they have. And so the term sarcopenic obesity is kind of an anachronism. It really doesn't really have much of an effect. Now, the one thing I think, one of the things we're thinking about now with the advent of these new GLP-1 agonists, these new drugs that may stimulate weight loss, which is not a bad thing. Old people, when they lose weight, almost half of their weight loss is probably from muscle. And so we need to really think about healthy ways for older people to lose weight and maintain the amount of muscle they have. We can do a lot with diet, I think, but
how do you suggest people do that with diet?
Well, your colleague Don Layman has been a big proponent of thinking about protein and its overall health effect. As I said, when older people lose weight, they lose a lot of muscle. And partly it's because if you think about it, an older person already has a low need for calories. And so if you think about an older person going on a 200 to 300 calorie a day deficit diet, that means that their protein intake is really low. It's probably below the recommended dietary allowance for people that are in weight balance. And going on a low calorie diet greatly reduces the amount of new proteins that are being made in your muscle. And so the way to stimulate protein synthesis in your muscle is simply by eating more protein. Now, obviously, it's a challenge because a lot of protein containing foods also have fat. So eating a high quality, low fat protein is a challenge. And it's not impossible. There are a lot of low fat, high quality proteins that are available, and or the use of a low fat protein supplement, like a whey protein supplement, during weight loss can really help ameliorate the loss of muscle.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that happens, well, first of all, do you believe that there's a normal trajectory to aging? Lots of the quote, healthy, sedentary population, the older adults, that in and of itself, that inactivity is not healthy. My question to you is, do you believe that there is a natural trajectory of decline? For example, based on what you know now, based on now you're looking at D3 creatine, which has not been the standard, which I am hoping will now become the standard. Do you believe the rates of sarcopenia muscle mass decline, right? They put it at 3 to 8% per decade. Do you believe that that is accurate? We haven't even been measuring muscle appropriately.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really good question. And what I've been trying to do, is get the public to think that sarcopenia is actually a problem. It's something that we should be able to do something about. People think about Alzheimer's disease and write to congressmen, and there's lots of money being spent. But unfortunately, people consider sarcopenia as an inevitable consequence of aging, and I don't think that that's true at all. One of the things that we see when we first did this, the first big study that we did using this method in about 1,300 men about 80 years old. This was a large cohort study that had been followed for a long time, and they were 80. And what I was struck by was the enormous variability in how much muscle they had. Some of the men had a lot of muscle, some of the men had a little bit of muscle. And one of the reasons why we're able to see this striking relationship between the amount of muscle and outcomes is because of this enormous variability in how much muscle people have. And I think part of the thing that we need to understand is what accounts for that variability. I think obviously one of those factors is how physically active we are. That's for sure. That affects a lot related to function. Part of it is genetic. Part of it is diet, um, and, um, and a lot of other potential factors. We know that when we've done some studies where we looked at what's the effect of putting an older person to bed. And when we first proposed to do these studies, one of our reviewers says, well, that's unethical. You can't do that. And then I came back and said, well, that's the number one therapy in the world.
Bed rest.
Bed rest is the number one therapy to treat everybody, especially old people in the world. And unless we understand what happens, um, we're not going to be able to prevent it. What we are able to show is that in 10 days of bed rest in healthy older people, about a kilogram of muscle is lost just from their legs.
A special thank you to Ned for sponsoring this episode of the show. Ned makes a mellow super blend latte for sleep. Oftentimes, I consume caffeine later on in the day and then struggle to get to bed, especially if the kids are being crazy or if I have deadlines to meet. This super blend chai latte has functional mushrooms, magnesium, clove and ginger, chamomile, ashwagandha without CBD, caffeine, melatonin, or dairy. So Ned shares third-party lab reports. But what I really love about it is it tastes amazing and it works. Here's how we use it in our house. Later on in the afternoon, when we are making our bad decision, drinking caffeine, we will oftentimes mix a scoop of in a glass, put it in the fridge, take it out about an hour before bed, put a handheld blender in there, maybe a dash of milk, take it and go to sleep. I think that this will absolutely transform your evening. I know that you will love it as much as we do in our house. You can head on over to Hello Ned, that's HELLONED.com/Dr. Lyon, and you'll get 15% off, or just enter the code Dr. Lyon to get 15% off your order.
It's amazing. And when you put young people to bed for 30 days, these are studies done by NASA, they lose about 400 grams. And so older people lose almost 3 times as much muscle in a third the period of time. So what accounts for that? Why is that? One of the things that happens is that inactivity tends to stimulate insulin resistance or the risk of diabetes. And that has a really powerful effect on how efficiently your body makes muscle. So in 10 days, older people that go to a hospital with normal glucose tolerance can be diagnosed with diabetes due to their inactivity and their illness. Some older people have inflammation, and that's another area that we really don't understand. There is this syndrome that some people call inflammaging. That is, some older people have markers of inflammation even if they don't have any chronic diseases. And the question has always been, well, is that because they haven't been diagnosed with the disease, or is that because there's something about aging? And I think that that's probably true, that inflammation, that I think is also variable from person to person, then affects other factors, including muscle and muscle function. And there are, a lot of other things that happen to us as we grow older. One of the things that I don't think is terribly well understood is we lose muscle cells as we grow older. And probably around 50 is when we get an accelerated loss of muscle cells, and that's probably related to how the brain ages. We lose what are called motor units that you know about, that are essentially the connection between the brain and the muscle cells themselves. Whether we can do anything about that is not terribly clear because it's difficult to measure. But I think that as we do more and more and more and more molecular tools become available to us, and now that we have the ability to actually measure how much muscle someone has, we'll kind of understand what this variability is all about.
How do you think that the individual listener at home, and we have a lot of practitioners that listen to this, will something like D3 creatine be available to the provider?
That's my hope. I just as a side, I've formed a company. My partner and I have licensed the intellectual property. We have IP in the U.S. and Canada and Europe, and it will be our first job is to convince the FDA that this measurement is important and actually means something. And then we hope that it'll be available to everybody and anybody. It's interesting that when we first published papers, I got a call from a colleague of mine who was at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they really liked this idea. And so they funded us. They gave us a big grant to validate our method in infants and children. So the first study that we did in this regard was taking really small infants. Our smallest was about a kilogram and measured muscle mass, just taking urine from their diaper. And we were able to measure the trajectory of gains in muscle mass while they're in the neonatal ICU. We've now published papers in boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and for the first time, the Muscular Dystrophy Association is funding us to do a longitudinal study in boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy to use this measurement perhaps as a marker for disease progression. Again, it's a completely non-invasive. They just swallow a little liquid or swallow a capsule. We take a urine sample and we know how much muscle they have. So my hope is that, if we get the hurdle past the FDA, that anybody can have this measurement. You can measure your children, which I think it's probably a good measurement of healthy growth, how much muscle children make. It's perhaps a marker for risk of obesity. So I think that we'll hopefully have a new day where this method is inexpensive and non-invasive, that people can do it. And I think that it probably will let us know, especially with older people, that their disability or risk of disability is due to muscle and perhaps not other kind of neurological problems that are also more prevalent.
Now that we're able to measure muscle mass directly, skeletal muscle mass directly, do you think that there will be a way to predict an optimal amount? As you said before, there is so much variation from the individual.
Yeah, that's another really good question, and what we're trying to figure out is there a cut point? And in our initial studies, what we see is, for example, in men that have less than 30% of their body is muscle, almost all of them have indicators of disability. So I think that now that we have women and we have Framingham and we have African Caribbeans, I think in a couple of years, we'll be able to do exactly what you say. We'll know what the level is, the cut point is for serious disability and development of disability over time. And then we'll be able to, for everybody, do our best to not get there. If we have a marker for, whether my mom or whether my grandmother is not going to be able to stand up from a toilet or walk around, then we'll be able to do something about it. And I hope that there's a lot more research, to try to find drugs that may help preserve muscle. But in the meantime, we know that there are things that we can do to help prevent that as well. We know that there are optimal diets. We know that strength training, even in, as I said, in people that are 90 years old, we can triple their strength in 10 weeks. And so there's a lot that we can do. It's not always easy. And it would be better if we could give people a pill. But right now, there are things that we can do, and there are people that really maintain their function well into their 80s and 90s.
That's brilliant. And I hope everybody listening, if you have an older family member, you should be sending this to them. But most importantly, if you're listening and you are confused, again, high quality dietary protein,
Yeah,
resistance training, all critical. And this is from a extraordinarily well established scientist. It's interesting because, as it relates to speaking to the public, you're in the trenches doing a lot of these studies. You've played a pivotal role in many. I mean, we'll link a handful of your studies, but there are so many studies with your name on it. One could spend days and days reading them. But I want to mention something that actually layers another complexity. We're talking about skeletal muscle mass. One of the things that is seen is that when an individual is obese, they have more, quote, muscle mass, but we haven't discussed muscle quality. And, I'm thinking about the intramyocellular fat, the intramuscular fat. There has to be another layer of not just looking at the skeletal mass itself, but the quality of that tissue.
yeah, that's really important too. We published, as I said, we had published this paper in obese um, older people, and showing that muscle mass is an important predictor of how much muscle they have. And then we also had CT scans where we could look at, um, you know, what we call myosteatosis, which is the amount of fat that's found in muscle. And surprisingly to me, I guess maybe not to everybody, is that it was an independent predictor of how strong they were. So for older people, especially for all older people, I think there is this increase in the amount of intramyocellular fat. And it's not just, in the spaces between muscle cells, but it's actually in the muscle cells themselves. And so there is an aspect of muscle quality that's affected, and we're now just beginning to understand it. For example, we know that weight loss can reduce the amount of fat that you have. Whether or not it can reduce the amount of fat that's in your muscle is not very well understood and poorly measured. We know that if you lose weight and exercise when you lose weight, you lose more visceral fat, the fat that's in your liver and in your viscera. Whether or not that translates to loss of fat in your muscle is a really good question that you have, and I think it's important. We just don't know enough about it right now, I don't think.
Mm. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of discussion about the, intracellular fat, also ceramides. Just
Yes,
a lot of changes from
right.
potentially
Well,
decreased flux.
well, yeah, exactly. I mean, fat is also associated with inflammation.
Hmm.
And so these so-called ceramides that are found in adipose tissue and in muscle are thought to be somewhat markers of inflammation that's due to fat. And as I said, inflammation itself causes insulin resistance and downregulates protein synthesis and accelerates the breakdown of proteins in muscle. So there are,
So
I
if you
mean,
were
there are
to
a lot of
target, yeah, and if you were to target the key, kind of the linchpin, it would make sense that the linchpin would be skeletal muscle because we can see.
exactly. That's right. I mean, muscle is the primary site where glucose is disposed of. When you eat carbohydrate, almost all of it goes right to your muscle. And so you drink a 16-ounce Coca-Cola, all of that glucose goes right into your muscle. So muscle, and if you're insulin resistant, then it causes a rise in your blood glucose levels that stimulates insulin production and a host of other metabolic effects that are not so great. So muscle is the primary site that I think is the effector of all these age-related changes. As you said, it's the longevity organ, not just for function, which is awfully important, but for a
Okay.
lot of other things.
When it comes to tackling insulin resistance, there is discussions on both ends of the spectrum, I think, and the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. There's some evidence to suggest, I understand that these were clamp studies from Gerald Schulman, looking at 18-year-old inactive college students that, brought to light insulin resistance in skeletal muscle. Is it about the insulin resistance in skeletal muscle first as the primary site of glucose disposal, or is it a hepatic issue? Is it a liver issue? Is it somewhere in the middle? Have you thought much about where?
Yeah, well, we've done a couple of studies along those lines. One was an interesting study that we published a few years ago. We took older people that had insulin resistance that were one step away from diabetes, that had impaired glucose tolerance. And we put them on a very low fat diet that was relatively high in protein and told them, eat however much food you want. And then after 3 months, we found that they lost about a pound of weight a week. And they were far, far more insulin sensitive just from a simple shift away from fat. And most of us eat a pretty high fat diet, or many of us do, and a lot of saturated fats. But the fact is that it affected both hepatic and peripheral insulin resistance. And in our bed rest studies, we measured, we did clamp studies, and we measured the insulin resistance in the liver and the muscle. And surprisingly to us is that there was a big increase in hepatic insulin resistance as a result of bed rest. And there's kind of as you suggest, a kind of an interaction between the liver and muscle that is complex enough that it's just important to say that it is, but that's where there's a lot of interest right now. I mean, there's a lot of interest in for example, use of metformin as a way to treat aging. I'm not necessarily certain that that's a great thing, but metformin has an effect of reducing hepatic insulin resistance.
Yes, it is something that we use in clinic all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, again, now with these new GLP-1 agonists that are available, those really make the biggest impact. But metformin has been around for
Yeah, no,
some
metformin's been around for a
time.
long time. It's the one drug that is kind of simulates caloric restriction. We know that caloric restriction does increase maximal lifespan in rodents. Um, and we know that in the diabetes prevention trial that metformin can, in people that are insulin resistant, can prevent diabetes. And so it's an inexpensive drug that doesn't cause weight loss, but it can prevent some of the complications. Yeah, the GLP-1 agonists, it will be interesting to see how that plays out. I have a colleague who runs the obesity clinic at Harvard. Her name is Caroline Apovian. I don't know if you know Caroline.
Mm-mm.
She said there's a year-long wait right now just for people to come into her clinic because of these GLP-1 agonists. It's going to change the face of medicine, I think.
Yes. And if an individual is consuming enough protein and doing resistance exercise, then they can preserve
Yeah,
skeletal mass.
that's right. In fact, we're writing a grant right now to really kind of understand the role that GLP-1 agonists may have on the loss of muscle mass, and how best we can preserve it. Whether increasing your dietary protein is sufficient to help prevent it, or you need activity as well.
Yeah. With all the talk in the media about these, and for the listener at home, the GLP-1 agonists, these are the Ozempic and Wegovy. Mounjaro is a combination product of GIP and GLP. I have not been able to find any mechanism of action that these GLP-1 agonists negatively affect skeletal muscle.
No, there's not. And I've been doing a lot of research, and partly it's because I think that the drug companies have not been terribly interested in measuring it. We know that it causes a pretty significant loss of fat and weight. And we hope that we'll be able to measure muscle loss with these, but it's a very important question.
Special thank you to Inside Tracker for sponsoring this episode of the show. I love Inside Tracker, and here's why. It is so important for you to understand exactly what is going on within your body, your own personal biomarkers. There's nothing more powerful than having information. With accurate information, you can course correct. People age at different speeds. Your biological age versus your chronological age are different. And it is so critical to understand what is happening under the hood. Now, I have used Inside Tracker. I've also used their blood work services, meaning someone came to my house, was super duper easy. You can either get your blood drawn in a lab or you can get a mobile blood draw. They have also recently added 3 new hormone markers: estradiol, progesterone, and TSH. These are all really critical indicators for what is happening within your body. TSH is the most sensitive marker to address thyroid function for men and women. So head on over to insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon and you'll get 20% off. I typically recommend individuals do blood work quarterly, and that is really helpful so that you can track everything. Head on over to insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon and get 20% off the entire store. Do you think that there are going to be a handful of biomarkers that can look at skeletal muscle health above and beyond mass? For example, myokines.
Yes, I think that there are some interesting ones that are coming along the way. Um, uh, uh, that that seem to be associated with longevity, that come very specifically from muscle. So I think that we'll find that there are biomarkers that are highly predictive of outcomes. The issue with biomarkers is how strong a relationship is there. But I think that now that we have the ability to look at a host of biomarkers that are, as you say, not just the amount of muscle. Once, it's interesting. Once we understand the role of muscle mass, then we can begin to explore all of the other potential biomarkers and how powerful and strong they are. And I think that there will be a new day, and there is a development of new drugs that target some of these myokines that we know have an effect on muscle and bone and metabolism in general.
I hope that the listener understands what a important conversation is that we're having, because up until this point, all the literature, the majority of the literature has really looked at lean body mass as a surrogate for muscle mass. And now and so because of this, and because of the issues with understanding skeletal muscle, we've really downplayed skeletal muscle mass, just the tissue, just the organ, the mass of the organ system, what you're bringing forth. And one of the reasons I was so grateful that you were open to coming on the podcast is this information is going to take a decade to come out to the public. And if we can collaborate and come together, and I can reach into the academia, to that ivory tower, and bring it out to the masses, it will allow individuals to begin to rethink all of the information that they are getting, because it doesn't, stand on, we always stand on the shoulders of giants, but sometimes a researcher or a group of collaborators come in and actually blow up the way in which it had been thought of in the past. And that's exactly what you guys have done.
Well, I think it's interesting that I wrote a book along with my colleague Irv Rosenberg in the early 90s called Biomarkers. And our central premise was that all of the things that had been thought of as biomarkers of aging, like bone density and um, blood pressure and insulin resistance, were not biomarkers for aging really at all, but were biomarkers for kind of how we go about living our lives. And I think that we now probably understand that what the effect of aging is specifically. I think for the first time we can really understand what the role of real aging is, as opposed to what you breathe and what you eat and how physically active you are. So I think that there's a lot of interesting. Yeah,
If you were to,
yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There's a little bit of a lag. So if the listener's getting frustrated for interruptions, this is a new studio here. There's a slight lag. When you think about designing an optimal diet to protect skeletal muscle mass and to think about longevity, for you, what would that be?
That I think that there are a couple of pieces of dietary advice that that it is true for everybody. That number one is reduce the amount of saturated fat that you eat. That's probably has the biggest single effect. Increase your consumption of high quality protein. Eat more fish. Increase your consumption of omega-3 fatty acids, and stay away from refined sugars. Those they're fairly simple, I think, but nutrition is one of those areas. I know that because you do what you do, you know that everybody has a different idea, a different opinion about what the best possible diet might be. And the so-called Mediterranean diet is a terrific diet, and it was a diet that was necessitated because the people that were eating it were poor, and they had to rely on increased amounts of vegetables and fish. And we know that in every society where that gets more money, I guess, more affluent, there's an increase in saturated fat intake and an increase in the diabetes and heart disease. And so those are the things that I think probably have the most biggest effect. The NIH is sponsoring some large trials, the National Institute on Aging, to understand what the long-term effects of caloric restriction might be. And there have been a couple of published. They spent about $30 million on a big study called Calorie. 2 years worth of caloric restriction, and these were in men and women who were not obese and not old. So and and so they didn't have any indices of chronic disease, and so they found, as you might expect, some improvement in insulin action. But the thing that I thought was an adverse effect is that they lost a considerable amount of lean mass. They didn't measure muscle necessarily. And so I worry that the idea of caloric restriction, however it may be manifested, if it's not done well, and I think that there's an NIA is going to sponsor some large caloric restriction studies with optimal diets. Protein seems to be really important in that regard. So, ideal diets for aging is a big, important, and moving target because things change as we grow older. It's hard to maintain the optimal diet if your calorie needs go down. If you only need 13 or 1400 calories a day to maintain your body weight, or you're trying to lose weight, it's more difficult to get all the things that you need, especially micronutrients.
Yeah. I have two thoughts about what you said. I would love to hear more. Do you think so? The body makes saturated fat. My question is it a saturated fat issue or is it a total caloric load issue? Number one. So I'll let you answer that
Sure.
one. And then I have another question for you.
I think saturated fat in and of itself is bad, and bad in a number of ways. Um, we can make rats diabetic in a week by just giving them a high saturated fat diet. It has a pretty bad effect, and we know that increasing your consumption of omega-3 fatty acids can actually have some improvements in health. Um, those are large kind of epi studies, and so longitudinal studies are still not terribly well documented. So, I mean, the thing about good fats versus bad fats is that all fats are highly calorie dense, as you suggest. Whether you eat saturated fats, if you reduce it and then replace it with um, olive oil, you'll still stay fat. so so I think there are good fats that can really help reduce inflammation, for example. Saturated fat probably increases inflammatory markers, but uh, the problem with fats is that they all um, are calorie dense.
It sounds as if
Well,
it's a
sure, yeah,
combination.
yeah, yeah.
It sounds as if it's somewhat of a combination. Certainly, some people it would not be ideal if their diet is high in saturated fat, and quite frankly, I do agree with you. Calorie control and potentially choosing leaner cuts of meat and leaner cuts of protein. Now that leads to my next question: is you mentioned high quality protein as it relates to aging, high quality protein as it relates to muscle, and there is a lot of discussion about how protein can be detrimental and it's easily replaced with lower qualities of protein. I'm curious as to how you see that fitting
Yeah.
in
Well, again,
as it relates to longevity.
part of the problem has been that consumption of proteins has also been associated with the consumption of fats. When you think about large epi studies, people that generally have a higher protein diet also have a higher fat diet, and so it's been difficult to kind of separate the effects of one from the other. As I said, when we did a study where we maintained dietary protein intake at about 20% of calories, but reduced fat intake to less than 20% of calories and increased their carbohydrate intake, they lost weight and they became more insulin sensitive. So, you know, every macronutrient has a different metabolic effect. So, for example, when you eat fat, there's no what's called a thermic effect. When you eat carbohydrate and protein, there's what's called the thermic effect of feeding that your colleague Don Layman has done a lot of research at. And what that means is that when you eat protein, your body processes it, and in fact, the protein goes into increasing synthesis rates in muscle, and that has a caloric cost. And so, when you eat protein and carbohydrate, some of those calories that you eat, increases your metabolic rate. When you eat fat, there is no change. Over the lips and to the hips is absolutely the case for fats. There is
Yeah.
no thermic effect of fat. And it again makes evolutionary sense if you think about it. Fat is by far the most calorie dense food that we can eat. And, 50,000 years ago, nobody voluntarily would decrease their food intake. And so during periods of time of uh, when humans went without food, they had to rely on their intrinsic fat stores. And we know that humans can go a very long period of time without eating any food because they can rely on their fat stores. And so fat has an important evolutionary advantage, during times of famine, but it's not it, during times when food is plentiful. It's not so great. And as you say, there are a lot of lower quality proteins that are rich in fat, and that's part of the problem. It's hard to separate one from the other. And high quality protein is generally pretty expensive as well.
And do you have a
Well,
favorite sources of
I
high
say
quality
salmon is
protein when you're
almost the
thinking about
superfood because the fat that it has in it is rich in omega threes, and it really has a lot of positive beneficial effects. Fish is great, I think, in a lot of ways because it's much lower in fat, and the fat that is generally in fish is the kind that has a positive metabolic effect.
Do you think that there is a certain gram amount? We know that the RDA is zero point 0.8 grams per kg. ProDage study came out. I know you've done a lot of work with the European working group with the Sarcopenia. Do you think that how can we reconcile the actual amount of protein that we give as it relates to
Well,
recommendations?
first of all, I think that as we grow older, we probably need more protein. I mean, we need more protein on a per kilogram basis than young people do. And the reason for that is older people generally have lower circulating levels of what we call anabolic hormones like testosterone or growth hormone. And so muscle is not as efficient at making proteins. And so the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, as you know, is zero point 0.8 grams of protein per kilo a day. When we put healthy old people on that amount of protein and give them the calories they need to maintain their weight, they lose muscle. So I think that you know high quality protein at the level of about 1.2 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilo a day is probably a very safe amount. There's very, very little evidence that even eating more than that has any detrimental effects on your kidney or any other, unless you have renal disease to start with. Eating more protein probably has very little side effects and bad side effects, I think.
Thank you to First Form for sponsoring this episode of the show. Today, I want to highlight Full Mega, which is an omega 3 fish oil. Omega 3 essential fatty acids are very important. And if you're like me, don't eat a lot of oily fish. So for me to get a robust source of omega 3 fatty acids is really hard, which is one reason why I love Full Mega. If you are not taking an omega 3 supplement, I think that this is one of the most critical things that you can do. Let me tell you a little bit about it, why you should have it. EPA, DHA are two healthy fats. They are very important for brain function, heart health, and muscle. First Form uses cold water, wild caught Icelandic mackerel, herring, anchovies, and sardines in the formulation of Full Mega. And no, you don't taste it. This is a real positive because that's one of the big things that people talk about when it comes to fish oil. I think you will love this product. We use this at home, and this is Full Mega. Go to firstform.com/Dr. Lyon. That's firstform, 1stphorm.com/Dr. Lyon and get your Full Mega. It is part of the Foundation series. Truly, truly exceptional. I would agree. And the evidence would support that. There is likely support also for protein turnover. I haven't ever seen any data that relates to too high
Yeah, no,
consumption
it's
of
interesting.
dietary
I've looked
protein.
at Looked at the literature, and we know that some athletes, especially power athletes, they consume massive quantities of protein. I mean, 2, 3 grams of protein per kilo a day. And yet none of them really report having kidney disease or any other bad effects, because generally they have an extremely high energy requirement, so they remain pretty lean.
Hmm. You had mentioned something earlier as it relates to circulating hormones. And you also had mentioned that we don't have treatments yet for sarcopenia. But the obvious in my mind, and I know that you have a study coming out with a mutual colleague, Dr. Ellen Binder, on
Sure.
the effects of testosterone. And, you do have a great paper here that is open access. We'll link it. And this is the effects of testosterone supplementation, body composition, lower body muscle function during severe exercise and diet-induced energy deficit. This was a proof of concept, single-centered randomized controlled trial. I really liked it. This was military based. So the military individuals are always early adopters. But do you think that there is a place for testosterone or some kind of hormone replacement in the treatment of myosteritis and or sarcopenia
Yeah,
and or frailty?
I when I was at GSK, I worked towards developing what's called a SARM. It's a selective androgen receptor modulator, and these are drugs that are selective in stimulating the androgen receptor in muscle, but don't have the side effects of testosterone. So that you could potentially give them to women. The problem with testosterone is that it's only available to men who are hypogonadal and not available to women. Only in Europe as a kind of a female Viagra. Um, but the SARMs, I think, show great promise. They're small molecules that can be taken orally, and they stimulate muscle protein synthesis. They're not in the market yet. I think there are some other ones that are probably along the way that show real promise. But testosterone is a good one. The one that you talked about is it's interesting for Navy SEALs and soldiers who are in extreme environments where they have to do a lot of physical activity and don't have time to eat. They don't eat very much. They become hypogonadal. Their testosterone levels go down, and so there's an accelerated loss of muscle. And so we did this study to kind of simulate that. We took young men and simulated that effect by greatly increasing how active they are, decreasing the amount of food that they did, and gave half of them testosterone and half placebo. And during the severe caloric deficit, there was very little effect on muscle. I think because there was an enormous decrease in muscle protein synthesis rates. But when they were allowed to eat ad libitum, the group that had the testosterone gained a lot more muscle back. So testosterone has a powerful effect on muscle. Many men who are hypogonadal, they become sarcopenic because they have low testosterone levels, and those men benefit from the use of testosterone. But I think that there are other potential drugs that are coming along the way that may have very positive effects without, hopefully, without
Hmm.
the side effects.
A, different than the SARM. So, for example, a SARM would be LGD. I think that there's a handful of SARMs that have been
Yeah, there have been
utilized
a number
in this
that are in
clinic.
development. There's one that I worked with called Novosarm, and that they went to trying to a lot of the research in muscle for reasons I won't get into, except to say that the FDA has been reluctant to consider sarcopenia as a treatable indication. The drug companies
I
have moved
know.
towards cachexia, which is loss of muscle secondary to disease. it's a much, much more difficult clinical situation, especially in patients with cancer, for example, that become anorectic and they profound inflammation. There was one that enobosarm seemed to have a pretty positive effect there, but the trial didn't get past the finish line in phase 3. So I think that there are some along the way, and another one that we haven't really discussed that is highly, highly prevalent in older women, perhaps due to sarcopenia, is incontinence, stress urinary incontinence. We know that that's related to the atrophy of pelvic floor muscles, which is also associated with sarcopenia. And these androgen receptor modulators may have some effect on helping to stimulate pelvic floor muscles. But we know that, again, exercises of the pelvic floor muscles can treat this, and it's enormously prevalent. Almost 70% of women over the age of 70 have some degree of stress urinary incontinence.
Yeah. And what ultimately we're seeing is there are so many drugs marketed and utilized for obesity, treating fat tissue, and maybe one or two, a handful, maybe 5 drugs treating
Well, I think
issues with
that's
skeletal
where
muscle.
I hope that we can get the public to really become advocates, because the amount of money that the Alzheimer's Association has been able to raise has been enormous. They're one of the largest charitable organizations in the country. The number one health issue that Congress hears about is Alzheimer's disease. As a result, they've earmarked a specific amount of research to the National Institute on Aging that has to go towards Alzheimer's research, almost half of their budget. And that's really, really because of public pressure. And I don't say that it's wrong. I think it's great. There have been new Alzheimer's drugs that have been approved that have very, very little effect on cognitive function, but yet they're approved by FDA, and that's because of advocacy. As you say, I think that the loss of muscle is kind of an existential threat, overwhelming almost everything else. The number one risk factor for development of Alzheimer's disease is diabetes and obesity. And we know that even moderate amounts of physical activity, walking as little as 3 times a week, has an effect on helping to prevent Alzheimer's disease. And so when we get down to it, almost every age-related disease is related to muscle in some way or another.
Well, Dr. Bill Evans, I think we should close it out there because that wraps everything that we spoke about up so nicely. I am grateful for your time. I feel like you are such an important figure in what's happening, and the work that you are doing and have done is going to change the way that we think about muscle, the way that we now can go forward and research it. Thank you so much for everything that you are doing. If you have not heard it yet today, I know that the world is very grateful for you.
It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today.